Hello, my name is Shafa Alia. Today I'm gonna present to you the material. Number one is the foreign exchange function. So, what is the foreign exchange market? Why is the foreign exchange market important? So, the foreign exchange market is used to convert the currency of one country into the country of another and provide some insurance against foreign exchange risk, the adverse consequences of unpredictable changes in exchange rates. The exchange rate is the rate at which one currency is converted into another. Events in the foreign exchange market affect firms' sales, profit, and strategy. So when do firms use the foreign exchange market? So the international companies use the foreign exchange market when the first is the payment they receive for export, the income they receive from foreign investment, or the income they receive from licensing agreements with foreign firms are in foreign currencies. Number two, they must pay a foreign company for its product or services in its country's currency. Number three, they have spare cash that they wish to invest for short terms in money markets. Number four is they are involved in currency speculation, which is the short term movement of funds from one currency to another in hopes of profiting from shifts in exchange rates. So, what can firm hedge against the foreign exchange? The foreign exchange market provides insurance to protect against foreign exchange risk, the possibility that unpredicted changes in current exchange rates will have adverse consequences for the firms. A firm that insures itself against foreign exchange risk is called hedging. The insurance or hedge against a possible adverse foreign exchange rate movement. Firms engage in a foreign exchanges, which means two parties agrees to exchange currency and execute the deal at some specific date in the future. So what is the difference between spot rates and forward rates? So the spot exchange rate is the rate at which a foreign exchange dealer converts one currency into another currency on a particular day. Spot exchange continually depending on the supply and demand for the currency and the other currencies. A forward exchange rate is the rate used for hedging in the forward market. Rates for currency exchange are typically quoted for 30, 90, and 180 days into the future. So, what is the currency swap? A currency swap is the simultaneously purchase and a sale of a given amount of foreign exchange for two different value dates. A swap are transacted. First is between international business and their banks. Number two is between banks. And number three is between government when it is desirable to move out of one currency into another for a limited period without incurring foreign exchange rate risk. So, what is the nature of the foreign exchange market? So, the foreign exchange market is a global network of bank, brokers, and foreign exchange dealer connected by electronic communication system. And the first is the most important trading centers are London, New York, Tokyo, and Singapore. The market is always open somewhere in the world. It never sleeps. So, thank you. That's it from me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kintaka. Now I want to explain about the economic theories about how currency exchange rate are determined. So the first one is at the most basic level, exchange rate are determined the demand and supply of one currency relative to the demand and supply of another. For example, if the demand of dollar is higher than the supply of them, and if the supply of rupiah is greater than the demand of them, then the dollar will appreciate against the rupiah or the rupiah will depreciate against the dollar. And the second one, I want to tell about the important factors that have the impact to determine the exchange rate. First is inflation, and then the second one is interest rate, and the third one is market psychology. First, for the inflation, there is the law of one price, which states that in competitive markets, free of transportation costs and a barrier to trade such as tariff is assumed to be zero. And in identical product sold in different country must sell for the same price when their price is expressed in terms of the same currency. For example, say that $1 is equal to 10,000 rupiah. And for example, for 1 kilogram coffee is equal to 50,000 rupiah, so that in US should be sold at $5. But say that in US, for 1 kilogram of coffee is sold at $4, the impact is the trader will buy coffee in US and then sell it in Indonesia because it's cheaper than in Indonesia. So the trader will gain 10,000 rupiah or $1 for each kilogram. This is an example of arbitrage. But the other impact is the demand of coffee in US will increase, and then it will increasing the price of coffee too. And then in Indonesia, the supply of coffee is increased, so the impact is the lower price of 1 kilogram of coffee. And then the price of both of country is will be equal. And then the second one is about purchasing power parity. This said, if the law of one price were true for all goods and services, the purchasing power parity or triple P exchange rate could be found from any individual set of price. By comparing the price of identical product in different countries, it would be possible to determine the real or triple P exchange rate that would exist if market were efficient. Because in efficient market, there is no impediment to the free flow of goods and services such as trade barrier. The less extreme version of triple P theory is given relatively efficient market, the price of a basket of goods should be roughly equivalent in each country. And then the triple P theory predicts that the dollar per rupiah exchange rate should be equivalent to the price in dollar per price in rupiah. For example, for a basket of goods cost in $2 in US, and this means 2,000 rupiah in Indonesia. Triple P theory predicts that the dollar per rupiah exchange rate will be $2 per 2,000 rupiah, 20,000 rupiah, I mean. Or we can say that it's $0.0001 per rupiah, or we can say that $1 is equal to 10,000 rupiah. According to the triple P theorem, the price should be the same. If they are not, it implies that the currency is either overvalued or undervalued against the dollar or rupiah. And then the third one is money supply. In a sense, triple P theory predicts that change in relative price will result in a change in exchange rate. But in theoretically, a country in which price inflation is running wild should expect that to see its currency will depreciate against that of a country in which inflation rates are lower. If we can predict what a country's future inflation rate is likely to be, we can also predict how the value of its currency relative to other currency or its exchange rate is likely to change. So the growth of a country's money supply determines its likely future inflation rate. We can say that a government, for example, increasing the money supply is they are giving people more money. So an increase in the money supply it will make easier for the banks to borrow money from the government, and then for individual and companies to borrow from the banks. So the result is an increase in credit, the increase in demand for goods and services. But if the supply if the supply of output does not grow as fast as the demand growth, the result will be inflation because the price will be higher in that period. For example, in this table is what happened in Bolivia in the mid 1980s. We can see that in July, the money supply is at 47,000 and etc. And then the price level at 4,000 and etc. And then the exchange rate is at 885. But in August, there is an increase of money supply almost at twice from the last month, and then the impact is the price level relative in 1982 is almost higher twice than the last month, and then the exchange rate is the peso faces the depreciation against the dollar. And then for the empirical test of triple P theories, they say that triple P theory seems to yield relatively accurate predictor in the long run, but it does not appear to be strong predictor of short-run movement in exchange rate because there are several factors may explain the failure of triple P theories to predict exchange rate more accurately in short run. The first one, because in triple P theory, they are assumed that transportation costs and barriers to trade are zero. But in practice, these factors are significant and they tend to create a significant price differential between countries. And then the second one is government's routine intervene. Some government in some country are fixing their exchange rate, so the exchange rate is not as the market. And then the second one, governments routinely intervene in international trade. They are creating tariff or non-tariff barrier to cross-border trade. These barriers to trade will impact the limitation of the ability of traders to use arbitrage to equalize price for the same product in different countries, which is required for the law of one price to hold. Government intervention in cross-border trade by violating the assumption of efficient market weakens the link between the relative price change and the relative exchange rate predicted by triple P theory. And then the third one is markets are dominated by a handful of multinational enterprise, for example, like Unilever and P&G, because they have sufficient market power to be able to exercise some influence over price. They can also control the distribution channel and differentiate their product offering between nations, for example, like their packaging. And then the second one is interest rate. Interest rate, economic theory tells us that interest rate reflects expectation about likely future inflation rates. In countries where inflation is expected to be high in interest rate, so the interest rate also will be high because the investor wants some compensation for the decline in the value of their money. This is what Fisher effect would say. So, informally, the Fisher effect states that a country's nominal interest rate is the sum of the real interest rate plus the inflation period for which the funds are able to be lent. For example, if real interest rate is 2% and the annual inflation is expected to be 3%, so then the nominal rate will be 5%. So when investors are free to transfer capital between countries, the real interest rate will be the same in every country. If difference in real interest rate will be the same interest did emerge between countries, arbitrage will soon equalize them. For example, if the interest rate in Indonesia was 5% and in US is only 3%, the investor will borrow money from the US. So this would make the demand for money of US increase and the real interest rate would also rise. This resulting the increase in demand for money in US would rise the real interest rate there, while increase in supply of foreign money in Indonesia would lower the real interest rate there. So this would be continue until the two of them set the real interest rate were equalized. Since the interest rates expectation about inflation, it follows that there must also be a link between interest rate and exchange rate. This link, also known as the international Fisher effect. This effect states that for two countries, the spot exchange rate should change in equal amount, but in opposite direction to the difference in nominal interest rate between the two countries. For example, if the US nominal interest rate is higher than in Indonesia, this reflecting the greater expectation inflation rates. So the value of dollar against the yen should fall by the interest rate differential in the future. So if the interest rate in the US say that 10%, but in Indonesia just 6%, we will expect that the value of dollar will depreciate by 4% against the Japan yen. I mean in Indonesian rupiah. As this case of triple P theory, in the long run, there seems to be a relationship between interest rate differential and subsequent change in spot of exchange rate. However, but like in triple P theory, the international Fisher effect is not a good predictor of short-run change in spot exchange rate. And then the last one is about market psychology. One reason may be the impact of investor psychology on short-run exchange rate movements. This evidence reveals that various psychological factors play an important role in determining the expectation of market traders as to likely future exchange rates. In turn, expectations have a tendency to become self-fulfilling prophecies. This is an example of market psychology that happened in September in 1992, when the international financier George Soros made a huge bet against the British pound. So he borrows a billion of pounds with all of his assets and then sold to the German Deutschmarks. This is also called short selling. So this can earn the speculator enormous profit if he can subsequently buy back the pounds which he sold at a much better exchange rate, and then use those pounds purchases cheaply to repay his loan. By selling pounds and buying Deutschmark, Soros helped to start pushing down the value of the pound of foreign exchange market. More importantly, when Soros started shorting the British pound, many foreign exchange rate knowing that Soros' reputation jumped to the bandwagon and did likewise. And then this triggered a classic bandwagon effect, with traders moving as a herd in the same direction at the same time. As the bandwagon effect gained momentum, with more traders selling the pound, their British pounds and purchasing Dutch mark in expectation of a decline in the pounds there. So their expectation became self-fulfilling prophecy. So according to a number of studies, investor psychology and bandwagon effects play a major role in determining the short-run exchange rate movements. However, these effects can hard to be predicted. But investor psychology can be influenced by political factors and by macroeconomic events such as the investment decisions of individual firms, many of which are only lucid the link into the macroeconomics fundamentals such as relative inflation rate. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Good morning. My name is Nelson Fernando. And I'm gonna discuss about the next topic, which is the gold standard. Basically, what's the gold standard? The gold standard refers to a system in which countries peg currencies to gold and guarantee their convertibility. The gold standard dates back to the ancient times when gold coins were a medium of exchange, unit of account, and a store of value. Payments for imports was made in gold or silver. Later, payment was made in paper currency which was linked to gold at a fixed rate. In the 1880s, most nations followed the gold standard. Here's the par value of the gold standard that time, like one US dollar equals to 23.22 grains of fine or pure gold. The gold par value refers to the amount of currency needed to purchase 1 ounce of gold. The exchange rate between two countries' currency will be determined by their relative gold contents. Here are the rules of the system. Number one, each country defined the value of its currency in terms of gold. Number two, exchange rate between any two currencies was calculated as X currency per ounce of gold divided to Y currency per ounce of gold. Number three, the exchange rate were set by arbitrage depending on the transportation costs of gold. Rule number four, central banks are restricted in not being able to issue more currency than gold reserves. Here are the classical gold standard, the exchange rate determination. For example, if the dollar is pegged to gold at US dollar at 30 US dollar equals to 1 ounce of gold, and the British pound is pegged to gold at £6 for 1 ounce of gold, it must be the case that the exchange rate is determined by the relative gold contents, like 30 US dollar equals to 6 pounds sterling, and so 5 US dollar equals to 1 pounds sterling. Why did the gold standard make sense? Why? Because the great strength of the gold standard was that it contained a powerful mechanism for achieving balance of trade equilibrium by all countries. Also, it's a condition when the income a country's resident earn from its exports is equal to the money its residents pay for imports. Also, it is this feature that continues to prompt calls to return to a gold standard. Then, the gold standard worked well from 1870s until 1914, but many governments financed their World War I expenditures by printing money and so created inflation. People lost confidence in the system. because it demanded gold for their currency, putting pressure on countries' gold reserves and forcing them to suspend gold convertibility. By 1939, the gold standard was no longer used. So I'm gonna tell you what happened between what happened in period between the war. Exchange rate fluctuated as countries widely used predatory depreciations of their currency as a mean of gaining advantage in the world export market. Attempts were made to restore the gold standard, but participants lacked in the political will to follow. Let me repeat. But participants lacked the political will to follow the rules of the game. Then the last one. What happened is the world economy characterized by tremendous instability and eventually economic breakdown, what is known as the Great Depression, which is between 1930 to 1939. So there are international economic disintegration between the Great Depression. Like many countries suffered during the Great Depressions. Not only U.S., not only the big countries, like almost the whole world, like many countries, they suffered through during the Great Depression. Major economic harm was done by restrictions on international trades and payments. These beggar thy neighbor policies provoked foreign retaliation and led to the disintegration of the world economy. All country situations could have been bettered through international cooperation, which is later known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, which later also will be explained by my friend. Thank you for your attention. That's for the gold standard. Thank you.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Raditya Chavadi Andres. This opportunity, I will present about the Bretton Woods system that include in chapter 11. Okay, so we can continue to the definition and the example. So, what is the Bretton Woods system? So, in the history, in the 1944, representatives from 44 countries met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international monetary system that would facilitate post-war economic growth. Because in 1944, it is clear that the Germans are losing the wars, and the countries need to rebuild their need to build their homes. So they are meet at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. So under the new agreements, there are 4 points. It is a fixed exchange rate system was established. And the second, all currencies were fixed to gold, but only the US dollar was directly convertible to gold. Then the valuation could not to be used for competitive purpose. And the last, a country could not devalue its currencies by more than 10% without IMF approval. So, what institutions were established at Bretton Woods? Bretton Woods concluded to establish 2 multinational institutions. The first is the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. Its function is to maintain order in the international monetary system through a combination of discipline and flexibility. And the second is the World Bank. The World Bank, in order to promote general economic development, and it's also called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD. The first, International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, conclude 4 points. The first is fixed exchange rates stop competitive devaluation and brought stability to the world trade environment. And the second, fixed exchange rates impose monetary discipline on countries. It's limiting price inflation. In case of fundamental disequilibrium, devaluation were permitted. And the fourth, or the last, the IMF lent foreign currencies to members during short periods of balance of payments deficits, when a rapid tightening of monetary or fiscal policy would hurt domestic employment. So the IMF here is to help countries that have financial difficulties like devaluation or inflation and others, and also as a lending institutions. The second is World Bank. The World Bank is institutions that consists of, and the World Bank is an institutions that countries can borrow from the World Bank. The countries can borrow from the World Bank in two ways. The first is under the IBRD scheme, where the money is raised through the bond sales in the international capital market. So the borrowers pay a market rate of interest and the bank's cost of fund plus a margin for expense. That a market rate of interest is the bank's cost of funds plus a margin of expense. And the second is through the International Development Agency, or an arm of the bank created in 1960. The idea loans go only to the poorest countries. So the poorest countries can demand a lending from the World Bank through the IDA, because IDA is particularly for the poorest countries, such as in Africa, in the and then Central Asia or Middle East now, because they are going into a civil war. In the World Bank, we are know that one Indonesian person and one FEBUI person. It is Ibu Sri Mulyani, which is held a position as a World Bank manager and COO. Thank you for the attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nadia Sirifi, and I'm going to present the next section, the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system. As explained in the previous section, the system of fixed exchange rates was established at Bretton Woods to build an enduring economic order that would facilitate post-war economic growth and also avoid the senseless competitive devaluations of the 1930s. However, the system worked well until the late 1960s, and the system finally collapsed in 1973. And since then, we have had a managed float system. To understand why the system collapsed, we need to recognize that the US dollar held a special role in fixed exchange rate system. Also, dollar occupied a central place in the system because it is the only currency that could be converted into gold, and as the currency that served as the reference point for all others. Lastly, the system relied on an economically well-managed US. Any pressure on the dollar to devalue could wreak havoc with the system, and that's exactly what occurred. Most economists trace the breakup of the fixed exchange rate system to the US macroeconomic policy package of 1965 till 1968, which was an increase in US government spending to finance both the Vietnam conflict and welfare programs. It was financed by an increase in the money supply instead of an increase in taxes. This led to a significant rise in price inflation, from less than 4% in 1966 to close to 9% by 1968. Also, the US trade balance began to deteriorate. With more money supply, people spent more, particularly on imports. And by 1971, For the first time since 1945, the United States was importing more than it was exporting. The increase in inflation and the worsening of the U.S. foreign trade position gave rise to the speculation in the foreign exchange market that the dollar would be devalued. Foreign exchange dealers began converting dollars to Deutschmark and other currencies than dollars, and central banks in Europe purchased billions of dollars to hold the dollar and other countries' exchange rate at its fixed exchange rate, given the great demand for Deutschmarks and other currencies. For example, the Germany Central Bank bought $1 billion on May 4th in 1970s and bought another billion the next day to hold the dollar and Deutschmark at its fixed exchange rate. To force the issue, President of the United States, President Nixon, announced in August 1971 that the dollar was no longer convertible into gold. He also announced that a new 10% tax on imports would remain in effect until U.S. trading partners agreed to revalue their currencies against the dollar, and in December 1971, an agreement was reached to devalue the dollar by about 8% against foreign currencies. The import tax was then removed. However, the problem was not solved. The U.S. balance of payments position continued to deteriorate throughout 1973, while the nation's money supply continued to expand at an inflationary rate. This caused another massive speculation, making foreign exchange dealers begin converting dollars to Deutschmarks and other currencies, and central banks in Europe purchased billions of dollars to prevent their currencies from appreciating against the dollar. After 2 waves of speculation, the collapse of the fixed exchange rate was inevitable, and by 1973, the system collapsed completely. The currencies of Japan and most European countries were floating against the dollar, and a new monetary system was adapted, the floating system, which was viewed as a temporary response to unmanageable speculation in the foreign exchange market. But now it has been used for more than 30 years as a permanent solution to the collapse of the fixed exchange rate. From the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system, we can conclude that the Bretton Woods system had an Achilles heel. The system could not work if its key currency, the US dollar, was under speculative attack. It could work only as long as the US inflation rate remained low and the United States did not run a balance of payment deficit. Once this thing occurred, the system soon became strained to the breaking point.
Hello, my name is Kasilvira, and I would like to continue the presentation about floating exchange rate regime. What is floating exchange rate? A floating exchange rate is a system exists when a country allows the foreign exchange market to determine the relative value of a currency. The floating exchange rate regime that followed the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system was formalized in January 1976, when IMF members met in Jamaica and agreed to the rules for the international monetary system that are in place today. There are 3 elements of Jamaica Agreement. The first one is floating rates were declared acceptable. IMF members were permitted to enter the foreign exchange market to even out unwarranted speculative fluctuations. The second one is gold was abandoned as a reserve asset. The IMF returned its gold reserve to members at the current market price, placing the proceeds in a trust fund to help a poor nation. IMF members were permitted to sell their own gold reserve at the market price. And the last one is total IMF quotas, or the amount members countries contribute to the IMF, were increased to $41 billion. In these sections, we are going to discuss about what has happened to exchange rate since 1971. Since 1973, exchange rates have been more volatile and less predictable than they were between 1945 and 1973 because of a few factors. The first one is the oil crisis in 1971. At that time, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, quadrupled the price of oil. The effect of this on US inflation rate and trade position resulted in a further decline in the value of the dollar. The second factor is the loss of confidence in the dollar that followed a sharp rise in US inflation rate in 1977 to 1978. The next factor is the oil crisis of 1979. This is the second time OPEC raised oil prices after 1971. The next factor is, despite a deteriorating balance of payments picture, the value of dollar rose unexpectedly in 1980 and 1985. This happened because strong economic growth in the US attracted heavy inflows of capital from foreign investors. High real interest rates attracted foreign investors seeking high returns on financial assets. At the same time, political conditions in other parts of the world, along with relatively slow economic growth in the developed countries of Europe, helped create the view that United States was a good place to invest. These inflows of capital increased the demand for dollars in the foreign exchange market, which pushed the value of the dollar upward against other currencies. The next factor is the rapid fall of the US dollar against the Japanese yen and German D-mark between 1985 and 1987, and against the yen between 1993 and 1995. The other factor is the partial collapse of the European monetary system in 1992, the 1997 Asian currency crisis, and the last factor is the decline in the value of the US dollar from 2001 and 2009. By 2002, however, foreigners had started to lose their appetite for US stocks and bonds, and the inflow of money into US slowed. Instead of reinvesting dollars earned from exports to the US in US financial assets, they exchanged those dollars for other currencies, particularly euros. One reason for this was the continued growth in the US trade deficit. In recent history, the value of the dollar has been determined by both market forces and government intervention. Under a floating exchange rate regime, market forces have produced a volatile dollar exchange rate. Governments have sometimes responded by intervening in the market, like buying or selling dollars, in an attempt to limit the market volatility and to correct what they see as overvaluation or potential undervaluation of the dollar. The frequency of government intervention in foreign exchange market explain why the current system is sometimes thought as a managed flow system or a dirty flow system.
Hello all, my name is Roy Darmawan. I'm going to presenting about cash presentation with a title Declining Cross-Border Capital Flows, Retreat or Reset. The case overview of this case solved from cross-border capital flows surged from $0.5 trillion in 1980 to a peak of $11.8 trillion in 2007. Major crashes in 2008 by financial institutions and corporations around the world routinely lend and borrow trillions of dollars between themselves. The value of mortgage-backed securities has collapsing because we the fall pushing prices and rising default rates on mortgage. Bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers sent shockwaves through the global financial markets. The U.S. Federal Reserve stepped into the breach by entering the commercial paper market, setting up a fund to purchase commercial paper at rate close to the rates for U.S. Treasury bills. And then, 5 years after crisis, the global capital market has still not fully recovered from its 2007 peak. The question one: what signal did the failure of Lehman Brothers send to the global capital market? How did the failure to act by the U.S. government as a sorbet the financial crisis? Our answer: the failure of Lehman Brothers huge pressure on the global capital market. From the trading opening on Wall Street was panic as Dow Jones, the average, immediately fell 300 points. The company's shares were up 93% to 26 cents per share. The outside, the outside of US, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers make a damage that estimate was $300 billion. The majority of stock exchange experienced at a decline such as the London Index, Euro Stock, and Indonesia. U.S. government did not help Lehman Brothers from bankruptcy, whereas Lehman Brothers is an investment bank that is closely connected with all work banks. The U.S. Federal Reserve found out that the corporate bankruptcy was just a common mechanism. However, the effects of Lehman bankruptcy have a broad impact on the global capital market in many countries, including America itself, which has endured the recession. Question 2. In your opinion, should the U.S. government have intervened to save Lehman Brothers? What other action could the government have taken? Our answer: we think the U.S. government need to first intervene Lehman Brothers itself, because Lehman Brothers has started operation as from 1850 until 2008. It's a long for bank investment size. This bank has connected with entire other banks globally. This position is very strategic, considering the large number of recent transactions between the party partners, especially with the housing loans that have been entirely provided by Lehman Brothers. Of course, all this having this will reduce the impact of losses that are wider than the 2008 financial crisis. Losses from Lehman bankruptcy, the U.S. Federal Reserve entered the commercial paper market, setting up a fund to purchase commercial paper at rates close to the rates for U.S. Treasury bills. And also, the U.S. government established the Troubled Asset Relief Program to inject capital into troubled banks by purchasing assets from them that were difficult to fail, such as mortgage-backed securities. Question 3. What does the fact that it took the effort of the federal government to shore up the commercial paper market imply about global capital markets? Our answer: commercial paper are money market securities issued by large cap companies and companies. Usually, the instrument is not just as long-term investment, but only as a purchase of inventory or for working capital management. With this purchase of commercial paper that is close to the benchmark interest rate, then the level of investment will increase so that the use of capital is more active, and of course this will decrease interest rates. Lower interest rates will make credit payment smoother, so they can overcome the final crisis when viewed from the cost of their credit as the trigger. Action like this will prevent the entire company from being threatened with bankruptcy. The last question, is the global capital market fully recovered from the financial crisis? In your opinion, has enough been done to guard against future financial crises of this nature? Our answer, 5 years after this crisis hit, the global capital market has still not fully recovered from its 2007 peak because the economy has grown slowly and the economic troubles persist in many regions, particularly in Europe, where several nation governments are burdened with unsustainably high levels of sovereign debt that limits their ability to deal with essentially social and high unemployment. We think government in the world have all experienced with when financial crisis happen. It becomes more careful in managing credit and investment lending so that it's no longer careless. Regulation began to be reformed in the financial sector. Of course, this is the new lesson for every country in dealing with the changes and action. Thank you.